She had every reason to turn away. Instead, she opened the door. By sunrise, that single choice would place her children, her home, and her own life beneath a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. The man she sheltered wore the uniform of an enemy she had been taught to fear, yet the first thing she noticed was not his insignia. It was the exhaustion in his eyes. What could make an ordinary mother risk everything for someone she had never met? And why would the man she saved spend the rest of his life trying to find her again? Some stories are remembered because battles were won. This one survived because compassion refused to surrender. The engine had already fallen silent long before Flight Lieutenant James Carter reached the ground. His parachute drifted through the cold evening air, carried by a wind that ignored borders, uniforms, and flags alike. He landed hard in a snow-covered forest, his ankle twisting beneath him as he struggled to stand. Somewhere beyond the trees came distant voices, scattered across the frozen hills, impossible to identify. Every direction felt equally uncertain. He limped forward anyway, following nothing more than instinct until he saw a narrow trail marked by fresh footprints. At the end of that path stood a woman gathering firewood into a worn wicker basket. Anna Keller froze only for a heartbeat. Her eyes moved from the torn fabric of his flight suit to the fear he could no longer hide. Neither of them spoke. The winter air carried only the sound of their breathing as two strangers realized that whatever happened next would change both of their lives forever. Anna did not step backward. She did not call for help. She simply looked at the stranger standing among the snow-covered pines, measuring him with the quiet caution of someone who had already lost too much to panic. James tried to speak, but the words came slowly, tangled between exhaustion and a heavy English accent she could not understand. He lowered his hands instead, offering the only language that still carried meaning. He was not asking for victory. He was asking for mercy. Anna glanced toward the narrow trail leading home. Two small children would already be waiting for her beside a stove with little firewood left. There was only one loaf of dark bread on the kitchen table, carefully saved to last until the next market day. Every practical thought told her to leave the man where he stood. Every lesson of survival demanded exactly that. Yet something stronger refused to let her walk away. Perhaps it was the memory of watching frightened young soldiers pass through the village in both directions, each wearing a different uniform but carrying the same tired eyes. Without speaking, she reached for the wicker basket in one hand and gently motioned for James to follow several steps behind. They crossed the quiet forest without another word, careful to leave as few footprints as possible. Ahead, a small stone cottage rested beneath a blanket of snow, its single chimney releasing a thin ribbon of smoke into the gray winter sky. Anna opened the back door just wide enough for James to slip inside before quietly fastening it again. Warm air from the wood stove carried the familiar scent of potatoes, onions, and burning pine, a simple comfort that suddenly felt fragile. Two children looked up from the small kitchen table. Lucas, 9 years old, tightened his grip on a carved wooden horse. His younger sister, Emma, clutched a patched wool blanket across her shoulders. Neither child spoke. They stared at the stranger with wide, uncertain eyes, searching their mother's face for an explanation. Anna knelt beside them and whispered only a few calm words. The children nodded without another question. It was the kind of silent trust that had become necessary in difficult times. She guided James toward a narrow storage room beneath the staircase where sacks of potatoes and jars of preserved vegetables lined rough wooden shelves. It was dry, warm enough, and hidden from anyone who might glance through the windows. James eased himself onto an old crate, wincing as he carefully removed his boot. His swollen ankle had already begun to stiffen. Anna disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a basin of warm water, clean cloth strips torn from an old linen sheet, and a small piece of homemade bread. She did not ask where he had come from. She did not ask whose side he had fought for. She simply cleaned the injury with steady hands, as though kindness itself had become the last ordinary thing still surviving inside the house. The cottage settled into a careful rhythm that depended more on silence than words. Before dawn, Anna carried a small cup of hot barley coffee substitute downstairs, followed by a bowl of thin potato soup that steamed gently in the cool air. James accepted both with a quiet nod, placing one hand over his heart in gratitude. It became their shared language. Every morning, she checked the swelling in his ankle, replacing the linen bandages with fresh strips warmed beside the stove. Every afternoon, Emma slipped into the storage room, carrying an extra piece of bread hidden beneath her apron, smiling shyly before hurrying away. Lucas never smiled at first. He simply watched the visitor with cautious curiosity until one evening, he rolled his carved wooden horse across the floor toward James without saying a word. James picked it up carefully, studied the smooth edges worn by years of small hands, then returned it with a gentle smile. The boy smiled back for the first time. Outside, winter continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Smoke drifted above neighboring rooftops. Church bells echoed faintly across the valley every Sunday morning. Farmers cleared snow from narrow roads while wagons creaked past the cottage. Inside those stone walls, fear remained, but it slowly made room for something unexpected. The enemy Anna had hidden no longer felt like a stranger. He had become another quiet heartbeat inside a house already carrying more hope than food. On the fifth morning, the quiet routine broke with 3 sharp knocks against the front door. No one moved at first. Even the fire seemed to crackle more softly. Anna looked toward the storage room beneath the staircase, and James understood before she spoke a single word. He gathered the folded blanket, the empty soup bowl, and every small trace that suggested another person had been living inside the house. Lucas quietly carried the carved wooden horse back to his bedroom. Emma picked up the extra cup from the kitchen table and slipped it into a cupboard with careful hands. By the time Anna opened the door, the cottage looked exactly as it always had. 2 uniformed officials stood outside, snow resting on their boots. One held a clipboard while the other removed his gloves against the cold. They explained that an Allied airman had reportedly landed somewhere near the village several days earlier. Every household would receive a routine inspection. Anna listened without interrupting. Her face revealed nothing beyond polite attention. She invited them inside and stepped aside. Their boots echoed across the wooden floor as they glanced into each room with practiced eyes. One official paused near the staircase. For a long second, he rested his hand on the worn railing, studying the narrow space below. Hidden only a few feet away, James held his breath. Then a small kettle began to whistle softly on the stove, and Anna turned with perfect calm, asking whether the gentleman would care for a cup of something warm before continuing. The visitors stayed only a few more minutes before thanking Anna for the warm drink and stepping back into the winter morning. The front door closed with a quiet click that seemed louder than the wind outside. No one inside the cottage spoke. Anna remained still until the sound of boots faded completely beyond the snow-covered road. Only then did she walk to the staircase and gently lift the hidden wooden panel. James looked up, still sitting in the dim light, his shoulders tense from holding perfectly still. For several long seconds, they simply looked at one another. No translation was needed. Both understood how close the danger had come. That evening, James took a small notebook from the inside pocket of his flight jacket. On one blank page, he slowly wrote the names of his parents, his younger sister, and the village where they lived in England. He hesitated before placing the notebook into Anna's hands. It was not a request for rescue. It was a quiet act of trust. Anna studied the unfamiliar words, then carefully folded the notebook, closed, and returned it to him with both hands. She understood that somewhere across the sea, another mother probably wondered every single day whether her son was still alive. In that quiet exchange, the war grew smaller than the shared hope of 2 families waiting for someone they loved to come home. By the second week, James could place weight on his injured ankle without losing his balance. Each careful step through the small storage room reminded him that he could not remain hidden forever. The cottage had become a refuge, but every sunrise also increased the risk for the family protecting him. Anna understood the same truth. One evening, after the children had fallen asleep beneath thick wool blankets, she unfolded an old paper map across the kitchen table. Candlelight flickered over faded roads, forests, and narrow streams drawn years before the war. She traced a quiet route with her finger, avoiding the larger villages and the main roads where travelers were more likely to be questioned. James watched closely, memorizing every turn without speaking. Before dawn 2 days later, Anna filled a small cloth bag with a loaf of dark bread, 2 boiled potatoes, a piece of hard cheese, and a metal flask of fresh water. Emma quietly tucked her own knitted scarf inside before anyone noticed. Lucas slipped the carved wooden horse into James's coat pocket with an embarrassed smile, as if the small figure could somehow guide him home. When James discovered it moments later, he looked toward the boy with grateful eyes. It was the first time since arriving that he spoke a single German word clearly enough for everyone to understand. He simply said, "Danke." It was enough. Sometimes the smallest word carried the greatest weight. They left while the sky was still the color of ash, before the village chimneys began releasing their morning smoke. Snow softened every sound beneath their boots as Anna led the way through a narrow forest path known only to families who gathered firewood long before the war. She stopped often, listening to the quiet around them with the patience of someone who had learned that silence could reveal as much as conversation. After nearly 3 miles, the trees opened onto a frozen stream winding across the valley. Anna unfolded the worn map one final time and pointed toward a distant ridgeline barely visible through the morning mist. Beyond those hills, she believed, James would have a better chance of finding friendly forces or people willing to help him continue south. He studied her face, searching for words that neither language seemed able to provide. Instead, he removed the small Royal Air Force wings from inside his jacket, hesitated for only a moment, and gently placed them in her hand. Anna looked at the silver badge resting against her weathered glove before carefully closing her fingers around it. No promises were spoken. None were needed. James adjusted the scarf Emma had knitted, tucked the carved wooden horse safely into his pocket, and began walking toward the white horizon. Anna remained where she stood until his figure disappeared into the falling snow, watching not an enemy leave, but another mother's son finding his way home. More than 20 years passed before James returned to the village. The roads were wider, the trees taller, and the silence of winter had been replaced by children laughing in streets that no longer carried the weight of fear. He stepped from a small bus with the same carved wooden horse still wrapped carefully inside his travel bag, its smooth edges worn by time, but never forgotten. The stone cottage remained, though its roof had been repaired and fresh flowers rested beneath the front window. It was Lucas, now a grown man with gray beginning to touch his hair, who opened the door. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then James reached into his coat and placed the little wooden horse between them. Recognition came instantly. Lucas smiled with tears gathering quietly in his eyes and invited him inside. Anna had passed away several years earlier after living a long, peaceful life surrounded by her children and grandchildren. That afternoon, they walked together to the small village cemetery. James laid a bouquet of white lilies beside her headstone and gently placed the silver Royal Air Force wings beneath the flowers. He stood there in silence until the church bell echoed across the valley. Finally, he whispered the words he had carried home for decades. "You saved far more than my life. You saved the part of me that still believed kindness could survive a war." The cold breeze moved softly through the trees, and for the first time since that winter morning long ago, the debt between two strangers no longer felt unfinished. She never carried a weapon, yet she proved that the quietest courage can leave the longest legacy.